My name is Fats. Welcome to my corner of the World Wide Web. This is Tchai, my co-host. I just gave him a snack, so he's going to smack his lips for approximately 10 minutes. And honestly, it's nobody's business but his. I was thinking, I've been doing a lot of vlogs. We've been running around town together. We've been drinking a lot of coffee. But what we haven't done is sat down with my teeny tiny little notebook, wrote out some teeny tiny little thoughts, and chatted about a teeny tiny little thing. Now, before I do these types of talks, I do love to preface these ones specifically by saying we are all entitled to our own opinions. I can be right and you can be right at the same time. I'm never wrong, but I'm not saying that me being right infringes on your rightness as well. We can coexist with different opinions, and if you don't agree with me, put it in the comments. Talk to me. We're not enemies. You might be putting me on and I might just be dumb. I'm right, but dumb right. You know what I'm saying? We can all have our different opinions. But this video specifically isn't a hater video. A lot of the information that I got were from fans. And I want to talk about a person and talk about a thing and just kind of flesh out what other people are saying and then add my bits and pieces to it. And what I want to talk about today is Stephen King. Stephen King, the man of the hour. In the time of us doing Summerween, it felt like I had to talk about the king of horror, this author, King himself. At the time of me finding out this information on Stephen King, I checked his Wikipedia page, and his Wikipedia page said that he has over 70 novels, over 130 short stories, and around 40 novellas, as well as 4 nonfiction books. And Stephen King is putting out content. He is constantly putting these things out. He almost never takes a break. George R.R. Martin, we're looking at you. But King is writing. And I do think that almost amplifies how much of a staple he is in the book community, because there are hundreds of books at this point. There's over 100 things that have his name on it. If you tally up the novellas, the short stories, as well as the novels themselves, you're over 100 for this singular man alone. Now, I went through quite a few different sources. I will put them all in the comments, and they aren't anything that you can like throw water to and hold up to the light, because these are all opinion sources. They're just people putting down their personal opinion on why they love Stephen King so much. And then I collected a few points that were similar between all of them, and I'm just going to kind of run through those as well as talk about the books that I personally have read. It's just kind of the formatting of what we're doing here. A little bit lackadaisical. You know I'm not the best at structuring videos. I get on here and I run my mouth. I might put some chapters in the video. I might not, because I forget to do that every single time I edit the video. So, first reason that everybody, this one was common in every single person's video. I mean, every single person's article on why they love Stephen King. And they put his characters. And I'm so glad that I saw that, because I want to talk about how Stephen King handles characters and how he handles not even the main characters, the side characters, everybody within the book. Specifically, when people were talking about characters, they were talking about how memorable they are. And they brought up Pennywise, Jack Torrance from The Shining, Annie Wilkes from Misery, and Holly Gibney from her trilogy. And a lot of people in these sources, they discussed how Stephen King's books are some of the best example of character-driven stories, not so much plot-driven stories. And then King himself, in his book on writing, he discusses how you can't write a horror book and you can't kill somebody off if you don't care about that character. And he says he does that even with his side characters. He thinks that a lot of literature gets it wrong by having a side character and treating them as this side piece, but never giving you the reason to care about them dying. So he gives that weight to every single person that he writes about. I say I wanted to talk about this because I have read a couple of fantasy books by King himself, and I felt like knowing the characters hindered my experience with his fantasy because it felt absolutely ponderous. But coming into the horror, I can see why he says you have to care about why somebody dies. Because the best example that I have of this specifically is Salem's Lot. Because Salem's Lot is a classic vampire story. There is a house that has a horrible history to it, and they believe it is haunted. But upon a strange man coming in to start an antique shop and people dying and disappearing, it becomes a classic hunt them down vampire novel. Now, what I loved about this is coming into the romantasy world of things and me reading the nasty vampire books. It felt good to get a classic vampire who sleeps in a coffin in a basement, can't go outside, stake through the heart type of vampire novel. But the reason I bring this up specifically in our character section of talking about Stephen King is when I read Salem's Lot, I didn't just care about these characters even. I cared about the town itself. I knew the busy street. I knew who was at the bar at night. I knew who was an alcoholic. I knew who was getting beaten by their husband. I knew who was having issues with their child. There was a woman in a scene who was attacked by a vampire, but I also got several chapters of her struggling with motherhood, her struggling to raise this child and her not feeling seen as she was dealing with postpartum, her husband beating her, her fantasizing about infanticide, and then she was killed by a vampire. So I knew this woman so deeply. She wasn't just the woman on the street next to the bar who passed. She was the woman who was related to the town sheriff, and that sheriff was beating her, and she was struggling as a mother. And as I went through this entire town turning into vampires, it wasn't just this guy is now a bloodsucker. It was, oh man, the guy who runs the town dump, who gets really frustrated when you don't separate out your metals or when you just drop stuff off at his front door, and who always has a slight tinge of scent to him. He's gone. I thought this book highlighted that well. And while it does make Stephen King's book feel like they meander through the story and like the action is slow getting, it's because I'm not reading for action 1 to lead into action 2. I'm reading for a character who experiences a situation, and a character who goes through their day, and a character who spends their time. And I do think that I don't read many authors in the horror realm that give so much time and attention to every street, every sip of coffee, every single employee in this town. And like I said, it can make a story drag. The story itself drags, but the deaths hit heavier. And I think that's what makes it that much more scary and that much more horrifying. Now, to add on to these characters, I want to say that how King handles fear is fabulous. Because fear for him isn't just this vampire tearing apart the town. It goes into the horrors behind alcoholism, and that's where you get Jack Torrance in The Shining. And it goes into the levels of obsession, and that's where you get Annie Wilkes from Misery, and it goes into fanhood with Annie Wilkes. So this concept of what it is to have fear, hold fear, be afraid of something, goes into a very normal person doing very normal human things. And with that, like I said, add that into the characters, add in how fear isn't just a monstrous thing. I want to bring up Pet Sematary, because Pet Sematary did something that I'm so thankful for, in that my main character wasn't dumb. I read so many horror novels where the story itself is perpetuated and it's dragged forward by all the mistakes and stupidity of your main character. However, in Pet Sematary, this was driven by a grieving father who was doing his best, who was this man of logic and theory, but was put on the stand of actually questioning a conversation that he had earlier and actually giving up his morals and giving up what he believed in. Because Pet Sematary is a story of a family who moves to a town so that the husband can work at the school infirmary. And behind the house in this town, there is a pet cemetery. And if you bury something there, it comes back, but a little bit different. This story follows a father who loses everything and questions the natural order of life that he had held personal, all in the effort of feeling heartbroken and wanting back those who you love. And every action that this main character took was an action that I could see myself taking, and I think that's also what made this a good, scary novel. This character was dealing with grief in a way that I would have dealt with grief, and that is what propelled the story forward. Very human interactions and conversations, and a flawed marriage, and a flawed relationship with those that you love, and what pushes you to make a decision that may not be the best, or maybe is the best, and what it looks like to be pushed into grief. Was such a good thing to read. It was slow. You are having several moments in this book where characters are sitting on a porch, drinking a beer, just talking. There's an older woman with arthritis who's ailing, and you're working at the school infirmary, and there are incompetent employees there, and you have to deal with the budget. These people are so human. However, what is scary is something that is very possible. Not in that I believe if you bury something in this scary cemetery, it's going to come to life, but possible in that I would have made that decision and I would be there right then. The ending is something like I could have seen myself get there. If I hit that level of grief, I would have been there. And I think that's what drags fear, and what makes Stephen King's fear and horror and these scary elements so scary, is that Jack Torrance in The Shining was a man dealing with addiction, and that drives the story forward. A very real human thing drives it, because Stephen King writes for the people, and then the plot is dragged on their heels. The next thing is, in both of these, both Pet Sematary as well as The Shining, Stephen King loves to not only make it very human and very real, but he brings into question in this discussion of human nature. There's almost a philosophical element written into these horror stories, if that makes sense. To go back to Pet Sematary and grief, there is a sense in which there is a discussion of at what point do your morals have to stand, and your understanding of life and what's wrong and what should not come back stand. And at what point will you be pushed past that? And at what point is it okay to give up your morals and your understanding? And he does well with that, in a way that I said, it only amplifies how much attention he's giving to these characters. I'm telling you, I don't see anybody give characters this level of thought and weight and humanity in a way that still allows for me to not think that the plot and the fear is in the back seat. They're equally in the car, driving the car. However, I know who I'm with and I know what decisions they're going to make, and everything they do is believable in my understanding of who they are. There was an article that said that the reason they love Stephen King and something he does differently is he has his King verse. He brings in like the same towns. It, as well as Dreamcatcher, are set in Derry, and Pet Sematary references Derry. He builds a world and he picks from it and he references things and he has characters that know another character, and it makes it real in that he built a world. The same way that people love the Marvelverse, you have a King verse. So if you hear a reference to another character, you're like, LOL, I wonder if that person is going to get killed by the clown soon. The next point that I have is how he writes, how King is writing these books. The way that he fleshes out a scene and the way that you go from chapter to chapter is very cinematic. I don't know how to describe it, but when you read Stephen King, it is like he's writing for you to truly experience it visually, which is so interesting. The way that he sets up a situation, the way that he drags you through a scene is very cinematic, and it makes it very easy to take on what is a very heavy, ponderous character sketch, because I'm experiencing it like I'm sitting in a movie theater. And like I said, I don't know how better to explain it to you other than you've got to read it. Because I think the way that he handles detail and the way that he chooses to emphasize certain parts within a scene and within a conversation within these characters makes it a movie. And I think that is so amazing. Is it slow? Does it drag? Yes, but I can see everything that I'm reading. When it comes to the words themselves, I would say that the sentences flow and the verbs he uses, they're very, like, how do I describe this? They're very muscular verbs. As you read these sentences, Stephen King puts a lot of weight on the verbs that drag you through it. And I think that might be why it feels so cinematic. The way these sentences are shaped and the way that you are taken through this paragraph, the verbs are muscular and they do push you along. I don't know, it's very King. I don't know how to explain it. Until you read a Stephen King book, it's hard to explain how I feel about these verbs. These verbs are very heavy, strong. They're muscular. Don't try to understand it until you read it, but once you read it, you'll see what I'm talking about. How each sentence pushes you forward, even though he is so slow moving with what's happening, and you're going to have 100 pages where you're like, I wish that we would get something scary. Why are we still talking about these people? The way it's written is very easy because you can tell King is a smart man. Stephen King is a very smart man, but it's a very accessible read. It doesn't have the flowy literary feel. He likes his verbs. Those verbs are heavy hitters. Now I want to loop back to fear because I forgot to talk about a book. And I want to talk about what I like about King and another thing that I think really adds to what he's doing. And this relates to Salem's Lot too. Stephen King bases his stories around an unoriginal idea and then remixes it. Because Salem's Lot, very, very classic representation of a vampire. That's that. And then I read The Outsider. The Outsider is built on folklore. Stephen King took some folklore and then he built a story around the folklore that he heard. And I loved it because it had such a good grounding because he didn't have to think of some original thought. He found folklore and then he said, How do I want to incorporate this into the town, into the stories? He loves a small town. He loves an all-white town. He loves that. But he took the folklore, made that folklore a bit more horrifying and a bit more contemporary, and then pushed his story into that. Now, The Outsider it opens up with an absolutely horrifying murder. However, due to the blood splatters, the semen splatters, the fingerprints, the eyewitnesses, they know who did it. They know. So they go get that man, throw him in prison. However, upon a little bit more research, they find that they have video evidence and more fingerprints placing him elsewhere at the exact time that the crime should have occurred. However, this man, he passes in an incident, so they don't have him to question anymore. He's gone. But as they do more research and as they get deeper and deeper and deeper into what's happening, they're finding some instances where it looks like these people are in two places at once, or there's a scary thing that is impersonating these people. This book gave me the absolute chills because this scary man is doing all the things that create a scary situation. King knows what people are afraid of. He knows. He knows that you're afraid of your daughter saying, "Mommy, there's a man outside." That's scary shiznit. Shut the F up. Get out of my house. Everybody get in the car. Let's go. And Stephen King knows that when you step in the shower and you can see a shadow behind the shower curtain, that's terrifying. Stephen King knows that clowns are scary. He knows what's scary, classically. And that's going to be in your book. He's not inventing fear. He's not inventing scary situations. He knows what's scary. That's going to be in there. And then he's going to walk you through it. I think that's another reason it feels so cinematic. He's taking these scenes that we see in movies and giving them to you to sit in your dark house and read. The Outsider was such a good book. To bring in characters again, Holly Gibney, our OCD detective. I love her as a character, her quirkiness, how she holds herself in a conversation, how she's put together, her tics. It's so good to have these characters that are so personalized because it's like, you have this alcoholic guy, you have this guy who's cheating on his wife, you have this guy over here, and then you have your OCD detective, and they all come together into the scariest situation. And I don't know, The Outsider has easily been my favorite Stephen King that I've read so far. But to get down to Stephen King knows what's scary and he knows what's triggering. You've got Carrie. Carrie is a story of a girl who just can't take being bullied anymore. And one thing I have written is Stephen King has written some scenes that stick. The pig blood scene in Carrie. The scene of Carrie's period leading to her being so intensely bullying. He knows how to give you something to relate to, which is great. I love it. That pig blood scene. If you are a 90s to 2000s baby, there is a large chance that pig blood scene sits in your brain and you can recall it right now. There's something about that. There's something about it and the balloon. There's something about these scenes that he's writing. There's something about Cujo that is so memorable and so classic. He's built memories for a generation. I would say the new generation doesn't know these books. The new generation, if I bring up Carrie and the Pig Blood, they have no idea what I'm talking about. However, there is a generation of us that is like, Carrie and the Pig Blood. With the memorability of these characters and scenes and the believability of these characters and the realness of these characters, I think that what stands out for me about him as an author is the empathy that I feel in the story. I don't think many horror books that I read give me empathy in that way. I'm just scared. I'm just experiencing something scary, or I'm experiencing something thrilling or gory or intense. But the empathy that Stephen King is able to put into me as I read these stories is like no other horror book that I read. Even though, like I've said it so many times, I feel like these books are so ponderous. But the time that I feel are just so annoying and so dragged out is what leads me to this empathy. So I think that's what keeps bringing me back. Do I think Stephen King is in my top 5 authors ever? No. Will I continue to read his books? Absolutely. There's so many things that I haven't read from him yet. Will I continue to talk about Stephen King? Yes. And it's because of all the things that I've said in this video. And it's why I just wanted to sit down and talk about him for a quick little chat about the king of horror, about an author that's truly shaped so much of literature that we have today. If you like a Stephen King or you hate Stephen King, please let me know in the comments. If you have a favorite Stephen King book that I didn't mention, please let me know. Dreamcatcher is next on my list to read, and I actually have never read or watched it, so that is also on my list of things to read. And, oh, The Stand. The Stand is also next on my Stephen King list. If there are any other Stephen King books that you liked, please let me know. If there's any Stephen King books that you hated, please let me know. If there's anything that you think Stephen King does well or horribly, please leave it in the comments. Please tell me about him. Please tell me if you haven't read him, or if maybe you want to pick him up, I can maybe leave you a recommendation. I'll talk to you next time.